Carl Schmitt's Political Theology, 4 chapters on the concept of sovereignty, 1922, is one of the most influential and controversial works in political theory. In this book, Schmitt presents his argument about the nature of sovereignty, the relationship between law and politics, and the theological underpinnings of modern political concepts. The book is particularly notable for its famous opening definition: sovereign is he who decides on the exception. This statement encapsulates Schmitt's view that sovereignty is not merely a legal construct, but an existential decision-making power that determines the boundaries of legal order itself. The concept of sovereignty. Schmitt's primary thesis revolves around the idea that legal order is ultimately grounded in the ability to decide on exceptional circumstances, situations that fall outside normal legal provisions. He argues that the true test of sovereignty is not the routine application of law, but the ability to suspend law in a crisis. By defining sovereignty in terms of decision, rather than normativity, Schmitt challenges the liberal tradition, which sees legal order as based on neutral, objective norms, rather than discretionary authority. For Schmitt, the state's legal framework is not self-sufficient. It depends on an underlying political authority capable of responding to extraordinary threats. This critique is aimed at legal positivists like Hans Kelsen, who argued that law derives legitimacy from its logical consistency and procedural validity. Schmitt, in contrast, contends that law's effectiveness is always dependent on the existence of a sovereign power that can make fundamental political decisions in moments of crisis. 2. The exception and the state of emergency. Schmitt's concept of the exception plays a central role in his political theory. He argues that while liberal democratic states often present themselves as operating under a system of impersonal legal norms, they are, in reality, dependent on the capacity to declare states of emergency. In times of crisis, whether war, revolution, or economic collapse, legal norms may be insufficient, and the sovereign must have the power to act outside them. The state of emergency, according to Schmitt, reveals the limits of legal formalism. No legal system can anticipate every possible crisis, and when an unforeseen situation arises, the sovereign must intervene to restore order. In this sense, sovereignty is not about following rules, but about deciding when the rules no longer apply. This notion challenges liberal constitutionalism, which assumes that laws and institutions can function independently of political power. 3. Political theology, the religious foundations of modern political thought. Schmitt's book also argues that modern political concepts are secularized theological ideas. He suggests that just as God was once seen as the ultimate authority in religious thought, the sovereign functions as the ultimate authority in political life. This comparison highlights the way political authority is often justified in quasi-religious terms, even in supposedly secular societies. He traces this theological political connection through historical examples, showing how medieval theological debates about divine omnipotence influenced early modern political theory. For instance, just as God's power was understood to be above natural law, the sovereign's authority is above legal norms in times of crisis. This analogy is meant to expose the hidden theological assumptions within supposedly neutral political and legal systems. For Schmitt, liberalism's attempt to separate politics from theology is both impossible and dangerous. He argues that liberal democracy's reliance on abstract norms and procedural legitimacy ignores the existential reality of political decision-making. Without a clear sovereign authority, Schmitt warns, liberal democracies are vulnerable to paralysis in times of crisis. Critique of liberalism and parliamentary democracy. A significant part of political theology is devoted to critiquing liberal democracy, which Schmitt sees as weak and incapable of making decisive political decisions. He argues that liberalism's emphasis on debate, proceduralism, and legal neutrality leads to indecisiveness. Unlike authoritarian regimes, which can act swiftly and decisively, liberal democracies are hampered by their commitment to pluralism and procedural legality. Schmitt sees parliamentary democracy as an outdated system that cannot handle modern political crises. He argues that the rise of mass politics and ideological conflicts has made parliamentary deliberation ineffective. Instead of genuine political decisions, liberal states produce endless negotiations and compromises that fail to resolve fundamental political questions. In his view, true sovereignty requires the ability to cut through legal and bureaucratic obstacles and impose decisive solutions. This critique of liberalism is closely linked to Schmitt's broader argument about the necessity of political authority. He sees liberalism as an attempt to depoliticize fundamental questions by framing them as technical or legal matters rather than existential decisions about power and survival. However, Schmitt contends that politics cannot be reduced to mere administration. It always involves fundamental conflicts that require sovereign decision-making. Number 5. The influence and legacy of political theology. Schmitt's ideas have had a profound and controversial impact on political theory. His emphasis on sovereignty and the exception influenced thinkers across the political spectrum, from conservative authoritarian theorists to leftist critics of liberal democracy. Some scholars see Schmitt as a precursor to contemporary critiques of neoliberal governance, which argue that emergency powers and executive authority have become central features of modern states. However, Schmitt's work is also deeply problematic due to his association with authoritarian and fascist politics. He joined the Nazi Party in 1933 and provided intellectual justifications for the regime's actions. This association has led many scholars to view his critique of liberalism as inherently anti-democratic and dangerous. Despite this controversy, Schmitt's analysis of sovereignty and the state of emergency remains highly relevant. His insights have been applied to discussions about executive power in times of crisis, from post-9/11 security measures to responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. His concept of the exception has been used to analyze how modern states justify extraordinary measures such as surveillance, emergency laws, and indefinite detention in the name of security. 6. Conclusion. Political theology is a challenging but essential work for understanding modern political thought. Schmitt's argument that sovereignty is defined by the ability to decide on the exception challenges conventional liberal and legalist views of politics. His critique of parliamentary democracy and legal formalism continues to provoke debate, especially in times of political crisis. However, Schmitt's ideas also carry significant risks. His emphasis on the necessity of strong sovereign authority can be used to justify authoritarianism and the suspension of democratic norms. While his critique of liberal proceduralism is valuable, his alternative, an unrestrained sovereign with the power to declare exceptions, is highly problematic. Ultimately, political theology forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of political authority, the limits of legal norms, and the relationship between law and power. Whether one agrees with Schmitt or not, his work remains a crucial reference point for anyone interested in the theory of sovereignty, emergency politics, and the hidden theological structures of modern governance.